Hi, Perryn.
Hey,
Welcome from all of us at Opera Canada. Welcome to the Canadian Opera Company and soon to be Toronto, although I know you're still in Houston, correct?
that is correct. I'm still in Houston, but it'll come. It'll come soon. I think it's important that we respect the boundaries and protocols that are put in place by the government. CSC is not actively working right now, but we have huge plans for the fall, obviously. But I'm okay in Houston, Texas right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get the border open before too long, hopefully. And
Yeah, I hope so.
Of course, respect the protocols. Absolutely. So for our viewing audience today, this is Perryn Leech, who will be the incoming General Director of the Canadian Opera Company. And I'm Lucia Cesaroni. I'm an Italian-Canadian opera singer, and I write a column for Opera Canada called Voice Leading. And I was really, really excited when Perryn was announced as the new leader, because one of the things you talk about a lot is community building and how we both bring in new people and I think even more importantly, go out and find out what people want, what communities feel, how do they feel, if anything, about the opera. And I just love to hear about your experience, both in Wales at English National and of course at Houston, in your ability to do this, both, generally speaking, and also if you want to get into specifics of programs, etc., initiatives. Sure. I'd love to hear it.
Sure. It's from my point of view, I'm not a trained musician. I didn't come into opera in that direction. So I came in from a world of theatre and technical theatre in that case, of really trying to just bring theatre to people. Every culture has a story, a history of telling their stories through words and music. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's music, sometimes it's combination, sometimes it's dance. But every community tells their stories in different ways. So, from my point of view, opera is just an extension of that. Yes, it's a particular art form that originated somewhere, but as it's evolved, as it's continued to evolve, it's telling different words and music, different stories through words and music. So as you start to think of it in that terms, I mean, before I even started English National Opera, I was with a touring opera company that went all around the smaller cities of the UK. That was our job. I loved seeing that you knew you were the one cultural event that people came to once a year in this theatre, that they would probably have a pantomime in, they would have some community work, they'd have the amateur dramatics, all those things. But then once a year, the professional company would come and produce opera of a really high quality, and just put that out there. But again, it's still into communities that, generally speaking, were pretty, look like me. They were white, middle class communities who would look forward to this opera coming. Theatre isn't like that. Theatre originates in the street, be it poetry, be it slam poetry. It just is constantly moving. And I think we as an art form, we have an opportunity to now feed in a lot more component parts into our musical storytelling, because from my point of view, I had the choice of two radio stations. Radio 1 was pop music. Radio 2 was people who'd grown out of pop music. That was it, basically. Then Radio 3 was my mum and dad's channel, because that was classical music. Radio 4 was news, and that was it. But now, if my son was a composer, he has world music from all over the place. He can have panpipes from the Andes. He can have South African music. So, of course, the musical culture will continue to evolve and change. And we as an art form need to be very, very reflective of that and have those voices represented. Because when we put that on our stages, then people go, oh, okay, this is something that is interesting to me. Or if we go into those communities and say, who are the great creators in your community? And that might be a visual artist, it might be a musician, who knows? It could be anybody. When you start creating projects with them to tell their stories, suddenly the combination is there that makes people go, okay, opera isn't quite what I thought it was. It's literally using words and music to tell stories. Okay, so let's tell those stories that now we've never told before. There's an opportunity there to do that. So for me, it's a very natural evolution of the art form. It's something I believe in, having toured a lot and having worked, Welsh National Opera, we started the work. Anthony Freud came to Houston, continued that work, and again, this is not about taking opera and saying this is good for you. If you ever have children, that doesn't ever work. You should like this. Well, I don't. Okay, fine. But if you cook the meal with them, they're invested in it. They have they part of that creative process. So that's the way we've done it in Houston. I think that there are a lot of opportunities. There are some extremely untold stories that are happening, in Canada now. That we just need to be able to listen, and that's part of the process as well. Listen to people who want to tell their stories. Find the people who can create work with you, and it allows you to talk about very meaningful things to a community. So, there have, of course, been some horrific stories coming out of Canada in the last few weeks with the Indigenous children. How do we use art to help the healing process start? That healing process is, right now it's extraordinarily raw, and there's some, more work that needs to be done to find out exactly the extent of this. But we need to use music as a healing part of the process, because for goodness sake, we all need to heal from the various wounds that life inflicts on us. So that's where I come from.
Any specific programs in Houston, for example? There are a lot of commonalities with Houston and Toronto in that we're large geographically, which sometimes can be challenging, the number of kilometers getting out there and getting people into the city. What about, for example, in Toronto, I'm sure you've done your homework already. There is a very successful, really vibrant Chinese community in Markham, which is about half an hour north of the city. Or the really big Italian community in the sort of west of Toronto, etc. As like two generalized examples. What kind of stuff, because I know there was a lot at HDO, did you guys do going out into the other communities who perhaps would not be the bums in the seats always?
This, let's be clear, this is not about only this isn't about audience building for the main stage theatre. This is about creating work, and if that becomes a byproduct, then that's fantastic, but that cannot be the primary aim. So how do we do that? We start to involve ourselves more in the community. We've structured the organization slightly differently now. We're looking for a person to run that side of the organization, which has been done a little bit piecemeal before now. Get somebody in there who's a director who really understands how to do community building, place making, etc. Then listen to those communities. And you're right, we'll never run out of stories to tell. That's for certain. We may run out of resources to tell those stories, but we'll never run out of stories to tell. So in terms of what we did in Houston, suddenly you'll have a chance meeting, and I had a chance meeting, for instance, with someone who works very much within the juvenile detention system. It wasn't an area we were particularly focused on at that point, but there was a wonderful program which I think started in Chicago, where they were working with female victims of sexual abuse to help them deal with the trauma of that and reintegrate themselves into society. And the impact that program had, from my memory, this was a sort of 10% of these women were able to reintegrate into what we might call a normal way of work, etc., etc. After that program, 8 out of the 10 consistently were able to go back in, and because they had something to hold on to. So that was a small scale project, 10 people in a group of people who've been taken advantage of in the past. It's a small thing, but the program requires you to do it with intensity and authenticity, because then you can actually build something that people, again, have to hold on to.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And you mentioned authenticity, and there's I think we overuse the word authentic and organic. However, I think, they're rendered somewhat meaningless today. But I think actually in this case, you're right. The way that we can, in this case right now in Canada, start to heal, but also beyond that, to tell authentic stories, we as a country, unlike the US and certainly unlike the UK or Europe, are very young. So there is a beautiful sense of opportunity in that as well, because as you say, the more we go out into other communities who perhaps their stories are fascinating and haven't been told in our milieu thus far as much, right? We can decide as Canadians of all walks of life and all colors and all creeds what our collective culture will be.
There has to be some reckoning as well about the past. Canada as a brand is relatively new. The country isn't new.
Yeah.
The settlers aren't new.
Yeah.
So we have to be also deeply respectful of that.
Absolutely. That's a great point.
So I mean, one of the things I found really interesting, I hadn't come across land acknowledgements, particularly in the US. It's not something that we'd come across. And when Julie McIsaac, who works for the CFC, introduced me once, she said he lives in a place called Houston, which is currently called Houston, on the lands of, and it really flicked a switch for me, because yes, I currently live in a place called Houston, but that Houston is less than 200 years old. There's been a settlement here for many, many hundreds of years. Yeah. It just wasn't by people like me. So we came and we decided it's called Houston, and we're going to have a ship channel, and we're going to have this, we're going to have a theatre, we're going to have this. That's all fine, but that's like a tiny section of the life of the planet and the life of the settlers on this planet. So how do we put that into a context as well?
And I think that's a beautiful idea, that you see the opportunity in this country to reach back and tell those stories as well along a continuum. I think that's a wonderful message coming in as our new general director, that this country, you're absolutely right, part of it is new, but it actually isn't new. And we can, that's true. And we have a larger than life art form. And so maybe we can tell those stories respectfully through art. And as you say, start to heal and start to figure out how to coexist better, hopefully.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's thank you. That's a great message. Pivoting a little bit to slightly lighter. I'm curious, and you've already partly answered it, but I just want to circle back. You mentioned the touring company as an example of your international experience, and you talked about HGO. Is there anything else in terms of the running of an organization? Are there things that work internationally you would like to see happen in the Canadian Opera Company, in Canada in general? For example, you had talked about wanting to create more connection between the Canadian companies, of which there aren't that many compared to other countries in which you've worked.
Yeah.
So would you speak to that? Because I loved that, and I think that's really interesting.
We're not in competition. The first thing you have to say is we're not in competition.
Yes.
We're certainly not in competition with even the other performing arts groups. All of that is to say that, there's some wonderful work going on at these other Canadian companies. Why wouldn't I want my patrons, who the vast majority of them are never going to go to Vancouver, or they're never going to go to Montreal just to see opera? They may go and they may see opera, but they won't go. Why don't I want to share that work? Because ultimately, if they're self-identified as opera lovers, then they're probably going to. It's not like I'm the only person who can have good ideas. But probably the people who run those companies can have good ideas too, and some of those are things that we would never program anyway. So you have new works that are being created all the time. Go to Banff, go and see their opera program. You'll see some of the young singers that you may then see in the future. So all of that is to say that you have a whole group of people who are self-identified as people who love opera. So why not share the information about what's going on elsewhere? And from an administration point of view, obviously we are the national company, but we also need to be helping to provide staff who are able to then work in those other companies, because there's a certain number of, if you're sitting in your bedroom as a 19-year-old thinking, what's my next job, in arts admin, then I want to be able to help support you either to go to whichever your local opera company is, or come to CFC, learn your trade, and then be able to go. So it's all a symbiotic relationship. It's not, there's no fight there. There's no. That seems very counterproductive. So going back to the actual question.
You're answering it.
Going back to the actual question, what I really hate is when opera companies get in their own way. And I think one of the things, I clearly come from a very practical persuasion, but when they get in their own way, when they don't do this because we've never done that at whatever company, we don't do that here. Well, okay, it's for the betterment of the artist, it's for a betterment of the rehearsal process. It'll create a better show, but you don't do it because some guy 15 years ago said that's the way we do it, and we're not prepared to change that. Okay, that's ridiculous.
So, apropos of administration, and you just mentioned, you gave me the perfect segue, developing artists. So I now have something of a portfolio career, I guess is the new thing we're calling it. So as an entrepreneur, I have started to consider that perhaps I would like to see more artists in management. And I started to think about, okay, so why at the symphony and the ballet, as probably the most analogous comparisons, there are far more artists who transition into management and administration, especially they often start out in casting, this kind of thing. How do we best develop the next generation? Assuming that we can agree, it would be great to have a balance of more artistic, creative thinkers once they are experienced artists and want to, let's say, transition. We could use that kind of thinking and those transferable skills. Mentorship, the skills pipeline. How obviously there can be sometimes a skills deficit coming from artists into administration. What can we do about this? How best to arc a career? How do we facilitate this?
You're right. The majority of people need to have some skills learned. Do we as organizations have the onus on us to provide that? That's a question, because again, I wouldn't expect you to say, well, look, I want to go into arts admin, and me saying, okay, I'm going to pay for you to go and do your degree for 3 years or 4 years or whatever, come back when you're finished. So I think that people, generally speaking, are identified, who self-identify, want to come in at a position of like, but I'm a hugely experienced singer, I can bring something to the table, and there's no doubt that that's probably true. But there's a whole load of other parts that you have to bring value to the organization on more than just the casting level.
Absolutely. And I've used two follow-ups. I've used casting as an entry point, and specifically, it's often where it starts for artists, etc., for singers. And then we are seeing, I should mention, some change with regard to the upper echelon. Gerke in Michigan, and there are multiple examples. Patricia Rissette in Opera St. Louis, etc. But what I'm wondering about specifically, and actually, I also just wanted to mention, when I talk about ballet and the symphony, specifically with the administration, I'm talking about the auditioning and casting piece of it. So in ballet and the symphony, it is almost always a dancer choosing a dancer. That's all I meant. A dancer choosing a dancer, and a violinist choosing a violinist. That's a slight.
The orchestra tends to come from the current orchestra, though. So when you're doing audition processes for symphonies or for opera ballet orchestras, it's very clearly set out in the CBA. Who has to be there? And you're right. There's a balance, and there's always the question of, do management have the balance, or do the players have the balance, and all of those things. But no, I mean, I think that the Gerke, the Pat Rosette kind of examples is because, again, there is a gap here. The vast majority of companies still are run by older white men. Okay, so how are we going to try and bridge some of those skill gaps? I would ask what success would look like for me when I leave COC. A 5-year contract, hopefully in 10 years' time. When I leave, I said, but success to me would be that I've mentored somebody of mixed race and/or non-binary gender. We'll get into the binary gender question, but a non-white guy.
I take your point. Yes. Understood.
That's actually the success, because at that point, once you start, again, it's about putting more voices around the table,
bringing in the idea of questioning things. I would call it diversity of thought.
Yeah, perfect.
Both different types of thoughts and from different types of people. That's absolutely. And I think artists from all kinds could offer, and as you say, in some organizations do offer quite a decent percentage of the administration. Do you think there's any role, and again, this isn't about the COC, for example, paying for a degree in arts administration, but is there a role perhaps using, again, if we're talking about diversity of thought, you have at your disposal a very successful group of people in your donors and patrons and board. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to create a mentorship program, either with existing COC employees because of their skills in leadership and business and administration and organizational efforts, etc.
Sure.
This is something that perhaps it is happening and I'm unaware of it, but I have yet to see quite that combination of skill share.
COC, we've got a brilliant group of people. I don't think it's really clear where each person's job stops and starts. And therefore, putting a mentorship position in place when those people themselves are working essentially, on a very loose rein, if you like, I think would be kind of difficult actually, because there is some work we need to do to say, look, if you want to go into arts admin, who is going to mentor you? Because right now it could only be ultimately Roberto. Okay, fine, but actually within most organizations, I couldn't say you can go and learn development from that person. You can go and learn. So I think the mentorship thing will come, but I think that will take a little bit longer than at some companies. I think there's some work to be done there. But in terms of the skill level, you're right. There are some skills there that are things that you can learn.
And I absolutely understand opera is leaner and leaner. Yes. However, I do wonder the slightly less lean part of it being the board members, perhaps in the future, not now, I understand you don't have the answer, but perhaps could be an untapped resource for either your existing ensemble, perhaps for them to be able to learn not only arts administration skills, leadership skills, organizational skills, fundamental, even the idea of entrepreneurship.
So let me just flip that question around to just for a second.
Sure.
Do we want to keep making the same mistakes we've been making for the last 30, 40 years? Because boards are very hierarchical.
Yeah.
Boards are very, very run traditionally by two different types. Very A-type people who've been hugely successful in their business, now have means and wealth and want to retire and still tell everybody what to do. And then they have the ladies who lunch and believe in the work and find it a social experiment. If we recruit and use those people to mentor, that is what's going to get taught to the next generation. What I wanted to have is a board of people who understand that has to change.
I love it.
So I would be very reticent to use my current board, and again, blanket statement, but
understood.
The majority of my board, I would not want them to be teaching the things that they believe are acceptable but the things that they would teach are not the things that are acceptable to a new workforce. I think that's exactly how opera companies have become so slow to turn in the water, because we're learning the lessons from people who are very set in one way, and that way worked for a period of time. We had people coming to the opera, they became donors, they gave big amounts of money, we did it one way, and all our programming was to please those people. If you want to have a wider programming, you have to be pleasing and relevant and understanding to a whole wider group of people. So learning from the people who were and I hate the word gatekeepers, but I'll use it, learning from the gatekeepers how to keep the gate is not necessarily how we evolve as an art form, I don't think.
I appreciate that, and it's so refreshing to hear someone really deeply challenging the foundations upon which, you know, so many of our companies are built. It's
and listen, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how they were built. That's where they got to where they got to.
Yeah, sure.
But if you start Uber, Google, whoever it may be, you start from a thing of like, let's start from a different place.
Yeah.
But if you start from IBM, you know, it's like if you start from IBM, you believe you're being wildly innovative. But compared to this group of upstarts over here, they're like, haha, nice try, Grandpa.
Yeah.
You know, so that's why we're in an interesting part of history right now, because yeah, I can come in and say, well, look, I have all this experience. Not all of that experience is good experience.
Right.
You know, me talking about how Glyndebourne used to work, it worked fantastically at the time for that environment, that workforce. And I came out of drama school thankful to have a job, and I would have worked for anything. That's not who the workforce are anymore. They know their own value. They know the skills they can bring to it. And yes, at times it's for an older generation person. It's like, can you just do the job I'm asking you to do, please? But it's an evolution. You know, that there's no point where it's going to be. You know, and there are plenty of people who leave organisations, even the most progressive and forward-thinking, who want more structure.
Yeah.
You know, again, it comes to how you're brought up as a human being as well, to a degree.
So, community building, new works. These are the questioning, remaking. Yeah. These are, I think it's fair to say, the cornerstone. Any other specifics? What else would you like? What would you like? That's a lot already. What would you like to see? It's just, I'd love to continue in this vein because, yeah, it's very exciting. I think.
Yeah, I think that those things cover the vast majority of it, because it constantly questioning who we are, what we want to be, how we get there, and putting a plan together. It's ultimately covers the full gamut. But you know, being open to talent from outside the traditional art form.
Last question. New works.
Yeah.
How, I know obviously your reputation precedes you, a lot of new work generated at HGO. How best to do that here?
So HGO has a long reputation, which has continued to evolve. I think that obviously I had an artistic director in Houston as well, who I don't want to be critical of, but we were telling this on a smaller scale. We were telling the stories that in communities and creating projects with them. On the main stage, we weren't really honoring that. So I think that, again, as we start to discover, I start to discover the DNA of Canada and Toronto and the stories that need to be told, you know, I need to be constantly on the lookout for the creative talents to realize that, to tell those stories. And again, it's just starting from a position of being open to that. And you know, certainly Alexander was very open to those conversations. New work is a very high batting risk. You know, you're taking a lot of swings, and occasionally you connect. So I think that if a company that only does 6 main stage operas a year, let's say you do a new work every other year, you know, you're probably, I mean, and the batting average is 1 in 5 productions gets a second outing. That's 10 every decade. You have something that sticks to a degree of some sort. That's a pretty low batting average. So I think we will be using the COC Theatre, which is 227 Front Street, more. I'm a firm believer in giving people the opportunity to learn their craft as well. So if it's a new Canadian composer or librettist or team, fine, bring them in, let them do a 1-act opera, a 40-minute opera, 45-minute opera. If it's good enough, then you can always expand it.
Sure.
Or if that story that's all it needs is 45 minutes to tell that's the arc of that story, that's fine. But again, expecting Andrew Lloyd Webber to write his first musical and it to be a smash hit is ridiculous. Yeah. No one would expect that. Rossini wrote over 80 operas, and we actually know about 3 or 4 of them now. In reality, I don't think many people described In the Heights as musical genius when it was done, but it allowed him as an artist to grow. Sure. And then do Hamilton, and actually now he's gone back and revised that story, and you go, yeah, there's definitely the heart of something is really special there as well. I don't think that was seen by that many people, what was seen was the fact it was, again, non-white casting. It was trying to give a voice to people who didn't have a voice beforehand. And now we get to the stage where Lin-Manuel Miranda is off social media because he's being told there aren't enough dark-skinned Hispanics in the film of In the Heights. And I get to the point, I had this argument with my kids all the time, my twins all the time in particular. It's like, I get it. When you all want to be part of the same community, but you don't actually, you all want to be individual. So I'm trans, I'm whatever it may be, you actually want to be recognized for all your individual traits, but be part of the whole community. Well, those two things are going to take a while for people to process.
It's a complex, incredible, complex issue.
Wildly.
All of these things.
Yeah. And so, of course, what we're trying to stop is the abuse and harassment of any group of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you consistently say my group has to be recognized more than the other group, then actually that's also part of the problem.
Yeah, it keeps us separate in some way. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Rather than, let's share the things the 98% things which we're all exactly the same about, and not the 2% that makes us different. But you can't do that in a world where people are harassed for that 2%, and that's the work we have to do. Some of the work we have to do first. Yeah. But it's as you say, it's endlessly nuanced, and we certainly can't solve those problems in a 15-minute Zoom call. But I think it's being aware of them and saying, look.
I think to add to your point, I would say that a big role for the arts and artists is also, if the more diversity we can have in the arts, people who look like all the various communities, then we can go out into the world, into sectors that are very different from our own, which is also bridging gaps and logistically possibly solving problems. The more interdisciplinary, the more diversity of thought we can have. If we as artists not only bring communities to us, but also go out into, and I also mean various sectors, we can also start to say, look, we have a lot of these transferable skills, and we come from a lot of diverse backgrounds, and we have a lot to offer, not only our voices, right, or our instruments, or etc., right? Yeah,
but people like being around artists because of that thought pattern, and we all know that the most employable people in the creative sectors now, be that software, IT, are people who have creative brains. It's not people who book learned things. Those are the people who are more eminently employable by employers. So again, how do we encourage? I completely agree with that. But it's interesting because the term artists, we were talking about organic being overused. The term artists, I had a choice at the age of 23, 24. I could either be a lighting designer or I could be a chief electrician. Those are my two choices, because I was lighting shows for small opera companies and getting well reviewed for them. And I had this practical skill that meant I was really good at turning other people's designs into practical stuff and focusing it, getting it lit. And I looked at the two at that time and went, okay, this is more secure. I can earn more money by being a production electrician than a head electrician. And I don't want, I can do that, but this is the path I'm taking. Does that mean I'm not an artist anymore? No, I've experienced art. I've made my own choice to go into, for want of a better word, arts administration by becoming a practical electrician, chief electrician, and going on my career path. So I think, again, when people talk about artists, they are tending to talk about either instrumentalists or voice artists. There are a lot of artists who have done stuff, across many different disciplines, who also wish to go into arts admin. And again, some people have that skill and some people don't. And I have a brilliant in Houston. They have a brilliant ex-musician who went and did a law degree. He wasn't allowed to be a musician by his parents. He went and did a law degree. He's now the most brilliant artistic administrator you could possibly imagine. So he played for 2.5, 3 years in the Dallas Symphony, but he's got a law degree and he loved reading through fine print of contracts. You couldn't ask anybody better.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the example, the shining example. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perryn, thank you so much for your generous.
Of course, it's lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too, and we're all really excited for you to be in Toronto and bring communities together and shake things up. Very excited.
I'll do the best I can. I've never been quiet, that's for sure. Great stuff. Lovely to meet you, Lucia.
Thank you very much. Bye.